So season 3 of The Chosen has just come out in theaters, and let me just say, you have got to see it. I mean, I just finished watching these first 2 episodes, and I have to say, they're pretty amazing, right? But here's the thing. If you're not careful, there's some things that you might miss, or things that won't mean as much unless you know the deeper background. So in this video, I want to share with you 4 key insights from scripture and history that you'll want to know before seeing this theatrical release of season 3. Now, before we begin, let me take a quick moment to thank Angel Studios, who is sponsoring this video. If you're not familiar with them, Angel Studios is the studio behind The Chosen, and they help to make it possible for shows like The Chosen to be free for everyone to enjoy. In fact, that's why it's so important for you to head to theaters this weekend to see season 3 in its theatrical release, because the proceeds from this will go to fund future seasons of the show and help to make it free for anyone to enjoy on the Angel Studios app. And so going to the theaters is an important way to pay it forward, right? So that the show can be free for everyone always. Additionally, seeing the show in theaters is just a really amazing experience. I mean, I remember going to see The Chosen's Christmas special in theaters last year, and while it was great to watch it later on the television at my home, there was just something special about seeing it in theaters. And that was definitely my experience this year as well, and you definitely want to have this experience. So if you're a fan of the show, and you're considering seeing these first 2 episodes in theaters, make sure to get your tickets this weekend. Opening weekend ticket sales have a huge impact on how long theaters will show these episodes. And like I said, these proceeds go to support future seasons of the show and make it free for everyone to enjoy. So make plans to take your whole family this weekend, invite your friends, gather your small group, and check out the first 2 episodes of season 3 in theaters. There's actually a link down below in the description where you can purchase tickets, and I've also put a link up here in the card. Now, let's dive into our key biblical and historical insights that you need to know before you go see season 3 in theaters. The first thing that you need to know is the life of a disciple and what that really meant. One of the key themes in season 3 is going to be helping the audience to understand what it really meant to be a disciple of Jesus and how costly that could be at times. And we begin to get a sense of this in the first 2 episodes, right? We see the toll that it takes on Simon and Eden. We learn what Jesus really asks of his disciples. And all of this makes even more sense when you understand what the relationship between a rabbi and a disciple really looked like at the time of Jesus. You see, it's hard for us to understand today just how close the relationship between a rabbi and a disciple was at that time. Right? We hear words like rabbi and disciple, and we translate them teacher and student. I mean, it brings to mind our Western idea of a teacher and a student. The teacher passes on information to the student. Often, that can be a completely unemotional relationship. It's just very transactional. There doesn't even have to be a connection between the two, between the teacher and the student, for this transaction to take place. But that is not at all how things worked between Jewish rabbis and their disciples. Theirs was an incredibly close relationship. Disciples would actually leave everything to follow their rabbi. They would go wherever their rabbi went, do what their rabbi did, learn from the words that the rabbi spoke, by how he tied his sandals, how he ate his food, how he combed over the bald spot on his head, right? Which for some of us would be a really important lesson. But the reason behind all of this was that in the end, the disciples didn't just want to know what their rabbi knew. They wanted to be their rabbi. Right? A disciple wanted it so that when people looked at him, they saw his rabbi. The relationship was that close and intimate and personal. And so because of the importance of this relationship, rabbis taught not just through lectures and tests, but through imitation and experience and inquiry. Right? They were constantly engaged with their disciples. But in order for that to take place, disciples had to leave everything to follow their rabbis. A disciple could only imitate his rabbi's walk if he was walking in the dust of his rabbi. He could only learn to pray like his rabbi if he was around to observe him pray. He could only notice the little things if he was constantly paying attention. All of this required him to be fully immersed in his relationship with his rabbi. It meant that he would be away from his home and his family for long periods of time. And this took a toll. Right? This is why Jesus says things like, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. At that time, words like love and hate didn't describe emotions, they described choices. Jesus is saying here, in order to be my disciples, you have to choose me over your wife, your kids, your parents, and even yourself. You have to be willing to give up everything to follow me. This is what it looks like to be my disciple. You put me first over everything. And in season 3, you're going to see both the toll that this takes and the intensity with which Jesus' disciples make such a commitment. Another thing that you'll want to know as you see the first 2 episodes of season 3 is who Herod is and why he has John the Baptist. As season 3 opens, we quickly learn that the situation with John the Baptist is getting worse. We learned in season 2 that he's been arrested. But now we're starting to hear more about Herod and the situation that John's in. And this is one of those places where even as we read the Bible, things can get muddy and confusing. You see, there are several Herods in Scripture. Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa, Herod Archelaus, and in this instance, we have Herod Antipas. Now, what's interesting about Herod Antipas is that his power really didn't extend very broadly, right? He wasn't a king of all Israel. He wasn't even the king of Jerusalem. In fact, he wasn't even a king at all. Right? The more accurate description of this Herod is the title that we find in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, Tetrarch. And this is because when his father, Herod the Great, died, that the same Herod who ordered that all young males be killed when Jesus was born, right? When he died, his lands were redistributed by Rome. In some of the land, they installed their own governors. They kept it for themselves. And in other parts, they gave them to Herod's sons. Antipas was in charge of the regions of Galilee and Perea. And since Galilee is where most of Jesus' ministry occurs, this is why we see Herod Antipas appear so prominently in the Gospels. This fact also gives us context for the conflict between Herod and John. John performed his ministry along the Jordan. He too crossed into Herod's territory. But what we're also left with as we watch this scene and as we see this situation unfold in the show is the question of why is Herod so upset with John and why is John so upset with Herod? What caused him to be arrested? And the answer to that question is actually fairly complex. You see, what happens is that Herod decides to marry a woman named Herodias. And the problem is that he's already married, and so is Herodias. Herodias is actually the wife of Herod's brother Philip, who is also a tetrarch. So for Herod to marry Herodias, not only must he divorce his wife, and not only must Herodias leave her husband, causing both of them to commit adultery. Additionally, Herodias is his niece, the daughter of his brother Aristobulus. And then there's the fact that this betrayal will ultimately lead to armed conflict between Herod's armies and the armies of his former wife's father, Aretas, costing innocent people their lives. The point is, this is a moral disaster on many levels. It will harm people far beyond those involved. It highlights the immorality of those in power, those leading this nation. And ultimately, as Scripture tells us, it's something that John will forfeit his life to resist. The question we have as we enter into season 3, though, is what will this mean for Jesus? Next, before you see these first 2 episodes of season 3, you'll also want to know a little bit more about who the Zealots are. In season 2, we were introduced to a new disciple named Simon, whom Jesus and the others call Z. But the reason that Simon is called Z is because when we meet him, he's part of a group called the Zealots. But what exactly does this word zealot mean? And why is this word in Scripture something that is attached to Simon's name every time he's described among the disciples? Well, for starters, Zealots were a religious and political movement that began around 6 AD with Judas of Galilee. They were known for violence. Like many, they believed that the Messiah would be a military leader who would come to overthrow Rome. You may often hear of Zealots referred to as the fourth philosophy. This is a term that comes from the first century historian Josephus. As Josephus is describing the primary groups of his time period in Israel, he mentions Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Each had a different philosophy concerning who the Messiah should be, how he would come, and how they should live in preparation for this. Zealots actually trace their name from the Hebrew word kenah, which means zeal or jealousy. And we see it in verses like Exodus 25, where God says, "You shall not bow down to other gods or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." And in Numbers 25, where Phinehas slew an Israelite man who brought a Midianite woman into the congregation of Yah because he was as zealous among them as God was. And it's this second verse that really gives us a sense of the zealot movement and their approach. They wanted to purify Israel by removing everyone and everything, sometimes including their fellow Israelites, that they believed was causing the people to turn away from God. And because of this, there were mixed feelings about the Zealots. Right? Some saw them as freedom fighters, others saw them as violent murderers. And this understanding adds depth and irony to the selection of Simon to be a disciple of Jesus. I mean, the very idea that Jesus was surrounding himself with a man like this both shocked his audience and taught them something critical about who Jesus was and who he invites to follow him. In fact, this actually leads us to another character and our final insight that you'll need to know before watching season 3, which is tax collectors. In the first 2 seasons, we learn about Matthew's former occupation as a tax collector. We see the wealth that this brings him, as well as the hatred. Simon despises him, his parents disown him, and all of this becomes relevant once again in season 3. But before you can truly appreciate some of the things that unfold, it's important to understand why Matthew was so despised for being a tax collector. You see, at the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire was expanding, and taxes had to be collected to pay for that expansion. It covered practically every piece of land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. It was expanding into Asia, Africa, Britain. And maintaining this type of empire was expensive. In order to pay for all of it, the Romans imposed 3 types of taxes. They required 1/10 of all harvested grain and 1/5 of harvested fruit. They imposed a poll tax, which was a set amount for each adult, and they also collected income tax of 1% of total business income. In addition to these taxes, there were also taxes on goods, tolls, and businesses. And because of the scale of this taxation, because it was so grand, Rome needed to hire local people to help enforce it. Governors would hire local people who understood the area, knew who the wealthy people were, and understood the local economy. And these people would bid for the privilege of collecting taxes because it could be incredibly lucrative. And if they won this opportunity, then they would pay Rome what was required and collect whatever they wanted, pocketing the profit. And so because of the way that the system was set up, tax collectors were notoriously dishonest. And when we look closely at scripture, we can see all sorts of hints about this, right? There is clear disdain for tax collectors. But we also get a glimpse into the level of wealth attached with this position. I mean, this is why Matthew would have been so hated. He was getting rich on the backs of his own people. They were already poor to begin with, right? Already oppressed by Roman taxes. They weren't even Roman citizens, which meant that they were paying for benefits that they didn't even receive. And here Matthew is making them pay more on top of that. He was despised. His own family almost certainly would have disowned him. So when Matthew just leaves his booth to follow Jesus, this is meant to capture our attention. For those living in the first century, they would have known just how much he was giving up to follow Jesus. They understood how great this sacrifice was, right? He was willing to give up everything. But the question we're wondering as we enter into season 3 is, by surrendering everything that he has, can Matthew ultimately gain everything that he truly desires? Well, there you have it, 4 biblical insights and historical insights that you need to know before watching season 3 of The Chosen. Now, if you haven't done it yet, make sure to get your tickets for opening weekend of this theatrical release of season 3. And you can find a link down in the description or in the card up here. And if you'd like to see other videos in my series breaking down each episode of The Chosen and giving you more insights like the ones in this video, then click this link right here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and God bless.